Welcome to Future Histories. My name is Jan Groß, and it is my great pleasure to welcome Kim Stanley Robinson on today's show. He is one of the most prominent science fiction authors of our time, and he is best known for exploring real utopian futures in his work, which makes him an ideal guest for Future Histories, I guess. Before we dive in, a quick note at the beginning of this first episode of the new year. First of all, welcome to 2026 and thank you for listening to Future Histories. I hope you are well. And then an announcement. From now on, the podcast will appear in a slightly different rhythm. We will continue to release a new episode every 2 weeks, but starting this year, the podcast will alternate regularly between German and English episodes. That means Future Histories will now also be appearing consistently in English. Find the English episodes only feed as Future Histories International on your favorite podcast platform or on futurehistories-international.com. This also means that if you're listening in English, I'd be especially happy if you helped spread the word by recommending the podcast to others, sharing episodes, for example, on social media, or including them in newsletters or reading lists or whatever you use for communication to many people. Helping Future Histories reach a wider international audience make a real difference, and there's a fantastic backlog of episodes in English as well, with guests like Nancy Fraser, Kohei Saito, Grace Blakely, Andreas Malm, Silvia Federici, Aaron Bananev, Wendy Brown, Evgeny Morozov, Matt Huber, Søren Mao, and many others. So please help to spread the word. Future Histories has now a consistent English output for our international audience. And now, please enjoy today's episode with Kim Stanley Robinson on real utopian futures. Welcome, Stan.
Thank you, Jan. It's good to be with you.
Well, it's my pleasure. Stan, this podcast has the subtitle Der Podcast zur Erweiterung unserer Vorstellung von Zukunft, and this roughly translates to the podcast for expanding our imagination of the future. And it seems to me that politically and culturally, this relationship to futurity is something that is very much up for renegotiation right now. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. Within certain strands of the contemporary left, there's a growing tendency to argue that the idea of the future as an open space of emancipatory possibilities no longer a convincing horizon, and instead we increasingly hear a diagnosis of collapse and sometimes even the end of the future as such. Kohei Saito, for example, recently said in a short video, and I quote him, "The future has collapsed. The future is barbarism." So there is, at least in parts of the left discourse, a sense of closure taking over with regard to futurity. And this is, of course, not the whole spectrum of left thinking, but it does seem to be a growing current. How do you see our contemporary relationship to futurity, and how do you assess this tension between closure and openness when it comes to imagining and politically engaging with alternative futures today?
Well, it's a good question, and it puts a finger on something that I have also been worrying about. And indeed, back in April, in a series of lectures, I began to speak about a word to describe it that I called futurecide, to match with genocide and ecocide, futurecide. The attempt of the Trump administration, in particular, to kill the future as a space of open possibilities and to proclaim that it was frozen in. And this isn't, I stopped using that formulation because no one can kill the future. This was a kind of a phrase to grab attention to what was going on, but it's not, I think it's not useful going forward as a term, and I've given up on it. I bring it up because of the specific nature of your question, the battle over the idea of the future. Some future is going to come. You cannot kill the future. You cannot say the future is barbarism. This is, of course, giving up what in those early months of the Trump administration I called preemptive capitulation, that you give up before you have to in hopes of reducing the harm that will come to you. Well, this is not a courageous response, not an appropriate response. The fight is still very much open. And what's funny is the future, to the extent that we can talk about it as cultural and even biophysical properties that have a certain trajectory and momentum, like the way that we can say an eclipse is going to happen because the orbits of the sun and the planets are, they've got trajectory and momentum that can be called in advance, is nowhere near as certain in human history. And yet there's some momentums involved that look like they will proceed no matter what we do now, climate change being one of them. But the human future is going to be more diverse. But this is just demographics. There will be the more rapidly growing parts of the human population right now all are not white people from the global north, where in fact populations are shrinking. So the populations will be more diverse. Now, the populations, will they be more inclusive and more equitable? Well, they can be. And given the incredible inequality of our moment, which is outdoes almost any moment in human history. The times of the god emperors, the times of late feudalism with kings and peasants, there was a much closer gap of inequality between kings and peasants in the Middle Ages than there is now between the 1% and the immiserated on the planet, which could number perhaps a billion. Depends on how you measure it. So the inequality now is so extreme that the likelihood is that the future will be more inclusive because people are not going to stand for it. And there's going to be both revolt, resistant general strikes, and legal reforms to reduce inequality just to keep the whole thing from blowing up. And now here I'm just telling a story like that, like the person you quoted. These are all science fiction stories, but I'm trying to talk about likelihoods here. So, in other words, this attack on DEI, as it's called in the United States, which was a kind of a legal or norm framework, sometimes legal, that one had to work towards diversity, inclusion, and equity or equality. Well, these are naming historical processes that are, in fact, happening, have been happening for the past half century since the end of the Second World War, and even before. And one can look at the legal standing of the legal standing of women, the legal standing of minors and children, the legal standing of animals. They've all grown since the 18th century in ways that can be identified in by studying the laws themselves, that growth can continue, probably will continue if you look at the general momentum of history. So there's, of course, this famous Martin Luther King Jr. statement, the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. With all due respect to the great Dr. King, the agency in that sentence is not identified. The arc of history is long, but we can bend it towards justice. It needs to be provisional and it needs to have the agent, which is to say the human community. And given the history of justice since the 18th century, there have been notable lapses, and to a certain extent, there's been because of the success of capitalism, justice has not had has not been bending in all ways towards the good in these last 200 years. But you can see for sure that it's a matter of human effort to make it happen. There's no inevitabilities. There's no historical determinism. It is a constant struggle between forces of good and of solidarity of all people, and then forces of appropriation and expropriation and oppression. So, in a way, although it's an encouraging slogan of Dr. King's, it has to be acknowledged that in some ways not much progress has been made. We live in an incredibly unequal world, and there's still mass suffering. So we're in the midst of the struggle. And in the midst of the struggle, you do not say, "Oh, we have lost." This is not the right thing to say. And so that part of the left, and I am a leftist, I'm an American leftist. I have my own version of what it means that is expressed in my novels, which means that it's a little bit hard for anyone, including me, to unpack and state in a phrase. And I think it's safest to say that I'm an American leftist. I like the vision that is put out by the phrase ecosocialism, because including the eco in socialism is a way of correcting for the imbalance of socialism in the first wave in its instrumental use of what was called nature, which is to say the biosphere, as if it was infinitely malleable and exploitable. So eco-socialism is one name, but I think just as an American leftist, I'm going to end by saying this: we're in the fight. It's an intense fight, but it's not over, and there are some signs that we've got some momentum on our side, as always.
Yes, absolutely. We have some momentum on our side as well. I would be interested with regard to this, let's say, slight tendency towards some sort of fatalism. I would argue that these imaginaries of the future, which are more pessimistic in that regard on the left, they do have a sort of aesthetic element to them as well. Oftentimes it's accompanied by narratives of collapse, for examples. And this again has a sort of, I would say, certain eschatological element to it as well. So there is a sort of aesthetic and narrative element to this idea of futurity as well. And I would be interested if you think about these questions that you yourself are concerned with through the lens of climate counter aesthetics, because I recently had the pleasure of recording an interview with Anna Kornblue, and she coined, I think, this phrase of climate counter aesthetics. And at least to me, it seemed as if your practice, your telling of stories, alternative futures as a form of investigation, I would even argue, is very much concerned with this question of constructing climate counter aesthetics that we can then all engage with, discuss about, fight over, whatever. Is this something that you use as a lens, this notion of climate counter aesthetics?
No, this is a new phrase to me and a new idea. I think I see what it's driving at. And in the idea of counter, I think what's going on there, then you have to postulate climate aesthetics in the first place. And given the climate crisis, the fact that we are beginning a mass extinction event that will hammer human civilization as well, I suppose that climate aesthetics must be dystopian and dark. And I don't like dystopia. I never have. It's too easy. And also, it's too soft. Most climate dystopias are written necessarily being novels. I'm going to speak mostly of novels, but even it's the same in movies. The protagonists live. Their families survive and struggle heroically into small enclaves and get back to a high-tech assisted earlier way of life, survivalist type stuff. This is all wrong. They would die too. And this stories need to be even darker. If you want the dystopia to be correct to the collapse of civilization, what you have to imagine is that you and your family would die of things like cholera or murder by casual insurgencies, or I mean to say, intruders that you couldn't protect yourself from, but dying of disease, but also that it would be intensely boring, that it would be tedious and boring to lose the 100 quote unquote energy slaves that we are all given by electrical systems. In other words, the electricity that you have at your command in the global north is the equal of about 100 human beings working full time for you to provide all the stuff and activities of your life. This comes from a recent Substack called The Climate Brink. Andrew Dressler and Zeke Housefather, who are very good on climate science. So the breakdown novels are not, if that's the climate aesthetic, we need a counter aesthetic really badly because there's a fake quality, there's a false consciousness in the dystopian imaginary that says it'd be interesting and I myself would survive. And it would be more interesting than modern urban and suburban life, which is intensely boring by design. And this is the mistake that J.G. Ballard made in England. Anything anything would be better than my boring English existence, including the breakdown of society. It's simply not true. In the breakdown of society, things would be even more boring, and also you would die. So I object, and I write utopian science fiction as a project. It's my literary project, and I want to speak for literature as a kind of religion or meaning generating system that is various and flexible and requires reading a whole lot of novels to get the full effect of it. And then that counter aesthetic would be this. We we can continue to fight towards decarbonization, towards adaptation for the wild creatures, for wildlife corridors. You see things like the 30 by 30 promises out of the recent Biosphere COP and the International Maritime Organization. If 30% of the land and the oceans was left to the wild creatures and humanity restricted their impacts to the other 70%, this is a step towards E.O. Wilson's Half Earth Project, where we leave half of the Earth to the wild creatures and live on the other half. And it all could work logistically in terms of food supplies for ourselves and living room for ourselves. This all could work. And China itself agreed to the 30 by 30 plan because, as crowded as China is, about 30% of their country's nation state land surface is already empty of humans because of Tibet, because of the mountains, because of the high deserts in the inner Mongolia. Humanity across this planet is usually now concentrated, and our impacts are general because of releasing sewage into the atmosphere. But land impacts are specific to land that can be protected. So the counter narrative, the counter aesthetic, would be a working utopia. And by which I mean a positive direction for history. That's my definition of utopia. It's not a destination, but a direction. And so utopian science fiction shows things getting better by ways that you can still believe in. And that's the ministry for the future, for sure. Uh, but all of my novels up to that point have been trying to do that same kind of thing, almost universally. I only wrote one dystopia, which was about my hometown and my youth, and was just a surrealism of the 1970s in Southern California. That's the only dystopia I ever wrote, called The Gold Coast. Other than that, I've been engaged in what I guess you could call this counter aesthetics or this counter narrative, but it's not. But I'm just part of a larger thing that can be called utopian science fiction, and I can immediately name people that began it, its continuance, and my beloved friends who some have passed and some are still here working hard. I'm part of a tradition.
And in one of your public talks, I heard you state that you believe science fiction to be the realism of our time and that you think it is the most important literary genre today. Could you maybe elaborate on both of these claims? They seem to be related to what you said before, I think.
Yes, yes, indeed. I've said that a lot. Science fiction is stories set in the future. And because it's been prominent in the cultural imaginary, even as an unconscious, even as an uncanny or as a despised stepchild with the mark of Cain on its forehead at all times. Even so, it's been part of our imaginary because people do tend to think about the future. When they try to think about it, it can be vague and confusing and frightening, threatening. But you read enough science fiction and everybody kind of runs into it through the movies, you get a sense of a consensus future that all of the stories melt together into. And even though that means it's incoherent, you have strands. So you think, oh, well, it will be filled with kind of Blade Runner-esque urban decay and flying cars, policemen on every corner, and a kind of a paranoid vision of the worst parts of now continuing, or you much more rarely you have a vision of things getting better in some sense of enlightenment progress. So science fiction has always been part of our imaginary, but what I'm saying is that the acceleration of history in the 21st century for sure, but really ever since World War II, has meant that now the present has kind of caught up with the old near future science fiction stories, so that now we all are cyborgs. We really do have time speeding up. We really do have artificial intelligence in some limited but heavily influenced by science fiction ideas sense. So, in other words, our current sense of AI is shaped by the fantasies about AI from the 1950s. Well, there's a lag there, and it's created more heat than light, more smoke than clarity. In other words, we're misunderstanding artificial intelligence because storytelling tends always to give AI agency and anthropomorphize it into a person. So the present is like a science fiction story that we are all writing together. It means that the genre as such is in a confusing state. If it's really the realism of our time, what distinguishes it from ordinary realism? And that's a good question that is not easy to answer. But I do think that we are, especially with the sudden rise of these large language models of ChatGPT and the DeepSeek and the other large language models that are now available to everybody, that the Turing test has been passed. So the Turing test was if there was a voice coming out to you behind a screen, and could you tell whether it was a human being talking to you or a computer talking to you? And what has to be said immediately is that turns out to be a very low bar, that we are easily fooled. And a plausible set of sentences being spoken behind a screen, if we say that's intelligence, then it's been passed. And we already have artificial intelligence in these large language models. We've noticed immediately that it's pretty crappy as intelligence goes. And we know for sure that it's a recombination of previous texts. So it's an optimizing set of algorithms to make plausible texts that match what other people have already said according to the prompt given it to it by your question or your prompt. So AIs are in fact not conscious, do not have agency, and the science fiction stories about them are up to this point wrong. And although the Turing test has been passed, we're still in this strange, uncanny valley, which is that zone that was identified back in the 60s where something is uncanny because it seems to be both human and not human at the same time. And the uncanny valley is a great place for science fiction stories, by the way. And so now we're living one. So I think this is enough on that theme, but you see what I'm saying. We are in a science fiction novel we're all writing together. That makes actual science fiction difficult to write now. And it also means that we're not understanding the present as well as we could by paying close attention to it. And in effect, maybe the new science fiction of now would be to write accurately based on the current situation and extrapolate it forward rather than reliving 1950s versions of the story. We got to update our science fiction to make it at all useful.
Absolutely. And I would really like to dig a little bit deeper into exactly these kinds of questions. And specifically, I would like to dig a little bit into our collective work of constructing these alternatives from the here and now, but into the hopefully structurally different future somewhat. And specifically, I would be interested in the affective layer of the broader project because change will have to successfully connect to the Lebenswelt of the people, to their everyday reality and cultural orientation. And when it comes to this effective layer, we can clearly see how, for example, the neoliberal revolution was quite successful in that regard. At least for a certain period in time, it successfully attached itself to certain demands and wishes coming from the New Left, for example, in the 70s. These demands around individual self-fulfillment and certain ideas of freedom and so on. And I think it's no longer successful in that, but it used to be extremely successful as a narrative, as a utopian narrative, even. I think Hayek framed it as such once, even though he was critical of utopian narratives from the left, of course. So, how do you think about this affective layer? How does it relate to the broader picture of societal transformation? And what could be a carrier for this affective attachment when it comes to alternative construction in a broader sense?
Yeah, well, this is a good question, and I have indeed been pondering it myself. And I'm glad you brought up Hayek because neoliberalism was a kind of a structure of feeling as well as a political economy that privileged the private over the public and the individual over the group. And I want to say immediately that humans are like bees. The bees individually are highly intelligent and capable creatures. But the idea of a bee by itself, or the idea of bees together acting without the hive, which stands for the entire social structure that they lived within to function, is hopefully indicative of we're the same. We are individuals, highly intelligent with our own projects, etc. But we are like bees with a hive, in that individually on our own, or all of us just interacting with each other in some kind of poorly theorized free state of individual contracts and lack of government, etc. The way that libertarianism begins to look like anarchy and the whole neoliberal movement simply looks like the top um, in it looks like capital grabbing more capital from labor in simple class terms, covered by a cover story of, oh, but you're so free, you're poor but you're proud, etc. And this indeed served to cover for a takeover of the results of everybody's work in what is just still classical capital appropriation. And neoliberalism was the triumph of capital over the state and over Keynesianism. So I will reference Joseph Vogt, V-O-G-T, I believe it is, a German writer. In English, his book is called The Ascendancy of Finance. And I like his analysis very much because it is a kind of leftist analysis that the state and finance are like conjoined twins. They are hand in hand in their work of governing the world, but they are arm wrestling for control over each other. And Vogt's history of modern times called the ascendancy of finance, because in neoliberalism, governments are devalued and put down, even though they make the laws and enforce them. And finance could not exist without the state there as a servant. But in Keynesianism, the state was the master, and finance had to jump to its control. One example of this would be simply during World War II, Great Britain nationalized the Bank of England, and it simply became an arm of the Treasury. And Keynesianism said government makes the money and backs the money with armies, laws, and prisons. and indemnifies it and makes sure that everybody believes in it. Because amongst other things, money is a sign of social trust, and that people in the society trust each other enough that money works as a, a method of exchange and as a storage of value. That social trust is the third leg of the tripod that money stands on, and the state makes that possible. So finance depends on the state, but then the state is financed by sometimes by finance, by private loans. And this is where it gets interesting. The state partly controls finance by taxation, and taxes have always been real. They're perhaps older than money, which is funny. This is a David Graeber in notion. And it may be true, but it doesn't matter. Now, taxes exist as the state's way of saying we control finance, and the state works for the people, and so does finance. So taxes, this was part of neoliberalism, was to dismantle the progressive taxation that was so intense after World War II. And so when I make my political suggestions in the world that we're in now, with climate change, with a very locked political moment, what does the leftist do? You can argue that everything has to change, but as a practical plan for, as you were talking about, ordinary public citizens, what do they do? The idea that everything has to change is a little bit unhelpful. So I've been trying to put it like this. Very rapid movement back to Keynesianism. The state seizes finance by way of progressive taxation. This is why I like the work of Thomas Piketty in France and his student Zuckman, the Zuckman taxes, the Piketty's analysis that progressive taxation on both income and assets, on both individuals and corporations, would be a powerful tool for the state to reclaim control over finance. And then you could impose carbon taxes, and that would be very useful. It's almost, you might say, obvious thing to do, to tax the poison that's killing us. And the more you use of it, the more you get taxed for it. And then the clean transition to clean energy, which is already going quite well, would go even better. And so this isn't one name for the battle, but Keynesianism is just the first step. After that, it should really shift to its ultimate form, which you could call social democracy, of which there's a version really in Germany, but the Scandinavian models are more famous. Social democracy. And then following that, I think democratic socialism or eco-socialism, eco-democratic socialism, in which the necessities of life for human beings are all public goods that are not for-profit industries, but are non-profits that we create for each other. Again, the hive. The hive exists to protect the individual bees from vicissitudes and make our teamwork more effective for everybody involved. So this is what I would call a stepwise sequence of legislatable events. You could legislate the first step of it if you had the right parliaments and congresses, and if the politicians hadn't been bought by the fossil fuel powers, and if people believed in democracy and actually voted in politicians that would do what they wanted them to rather than what the fossil fuel and other private interests want them to, what capital wants them to do. Are these politicians representative of us, or are they representatives of capital? Well, their funding sources would say they're representatives of capital. Their voting records would say they're representatives of us. So could the laws be changed to cut capital out of the choice of our political representatives? Yes, that too could happen. So you can, I mean, admittedly, this is like running the table when you play pool. All the balls kind of have to fall, and sometimes at once, to make it coherent as a plan. But there's nothing impossible in this plan. There's nothing except for ordinary politics as it's been practiced, parties that represent these positions. And in the European system, in Germany, you can simply say, well, I'll vote for the Greens, or I'll vote for the Ecosocialists, or I'll vote for the whatever left-wing party that is most strategically located in their votes and their positions to represent what I want, and hopefully that party will pursue it. And you've got these coalitions of parties. This is flexible. This is a better system of legislation than the American system of two parties, both of which are problematic, and you have no great choice except to choose the one that's more on your side and then hope that it doesn't flake out on you. I wish we had the European parliamentary system here in the States just to make it more fine-tuned. And yet, in terms of getting things done, it's also clear that the parliamentary systems can easily get locked up. So, of course, I shouldn't get into the details of the actual legislatures. The point is this: laws could be passed that return the power in this battle between state and finance, between government and capital, to government, and then it would be a little bit more in the hands of the people and working for the good of the people. And this is now I want to say, as an American leftist, German political thinking is often so enthusiastic, so intense, and impatient, you might say, for results. I wonder often if it's a matter of the German language being so precise, and with the verb coming last, you always have to wait until someone finishes what they're saying. I mean, there's aspects of these languages that are interesting in the way they manifest in the politics and the culture of a country. Who can tell about that stuff? But what I can say is, although my program sounds kind of weak as I describe it, to me, I nevertheless hold to it as being a way to go forward right now.
Yeah, so much interesting stuff. German political thinking described as being impatient does not really resonate with my everyday experience of the stasis of German politics, but I get what you mean in general. I think there's a fantastic paper by a friend of mine, Christoph Sorg, and it's titled Finance as a Form of Planning. And what you just described very much resonates with this kind of thinking that he, and this proposals actually, that he describes within this paper, and even going a bit further in many regards, I would say. And in your novel, Ministry of the Future, an essential political technology, so to speak, that is being used in this near future scenario can be described as finance as a form of planning, I would say.
Yes.
In this case, it's carbon coin that makes the transition to green energy profitable in a form of green Keynesianism, one might say.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's a caveat to that because, at least within the book, there's quite a bit of eco-terrorism going on as well, making the transition not so voluntary after all. Because, I mean, you yourself described this Keynesian vision as quote unquote weak in the sense of not being super bold in the demands and stuff. But I think there's also the question if capital in general can be nudged and incentivized into a real structural change, let's say, or if it wouldn't, in a realist perspective, like put every chips into avoiding these kinds of structural changes, and then the mechanisms of mere legislation might not be sufficient to get where we need to go. I mean, there are different examples for that. There are examples of governments that were couped when they tried to do things differently. Then there's a structural sclerosis, let's say, that is built into the European Parliament system as well, very much so, I would say. So I would be interested in your take on this because, at least in the novel, there is a different kind of energy, a different kind of practice is needed in order to get capital to do certain kinds of things that it wouldn't be willing to do with mere legislation, so to speak.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, and I'm the Ministry for the Future is perhaps a description of green Keynesianism working. I don't want to overstate what happens in that novel, but the carbon coin I do think is important as being Keynesian government assertion of control over finance, at least in the fact that it makes and backs fiat money, central banks. and that this is how the world works right now. People need to get paid for their work. There are visions, certain versions of communism where we don't need money, but right now we have it and we need it in order to, people have to pay to live. And this, of course, is already one of the scandals of it. But given that system, can capitalism be dismantled to democratic socialism? And yet at that point there would still be money. So again, green Keynesianism, where the government insists, we create the money and back it, and therefore in its first spendings, we are going to spend it on these things that will be legislated. So it's a combination of quantitative easing, like we saw in 2008 in the financial crisis and in 2020 in the pandemic. In both cases, something like 10 to 15 trillion US dollars was generated through bond sales. And in the first case, 2008, simply given to private banks to save them from their own stupidity. And so the economy could go on in its usual capitalist way, of where the 1% survived in style and the lowest 40% once again was dispossessed. Not good. In 2020, it was better. An equal amount of money was generated from scratch and given to businesses to keep them from collapsing when people were asked to stay at home at the start of the pandemic. Nevertheless, and these were both directed and targeted. The money that was generated was in fact distributed. And there was an interesting case in the United States of the United States bailing out and therefore becoming a major shareholder of one of the three biggest car companies, automobiles. There was an indication there that at a moment of crisis, the government could simply nationalize the private banks and the fossil fuel companies and say, we will save you from collapse, but we now own you and you are now a public utility. And this was the plot of my New York 2140. And it went as far as it could at the time I was writing it, which was, I would guess, about 2015 or so. Then I began to think, well, but the central banks are still a problem and are a source of solution as well. And that led from New York 2140 to the Ministry for the Future, where the carbon coin is the four or five biggest and most solvent central banks, and it would have to include the United States and China and the EU. And all of these central banks were, until recently, members of a study group or a think tank called the Network for Greening the Financial System. It already exists, this network. The United States withdrew from it under Trump, but this is part of the Trump Götterdämmerung of wrecking everything. And there will be a post-Trump, there will be a post-Putin. And if the United States were to come back into the Network for Greening the Financial System, that would be one sign. And what you need is about $1 trillion a year generated by the central banks and tagged and designated from the very start as green expenditures, which would go to private businesses. I'm really not talking about very much of a overthrow of the current order. It really is green Keynesianism, as you pointed out, as you identified it. And I think that's right. The governments would spend this money the way they spent it on the war effort in World War II. And in fact, private corporations benefited hugely out of the war machinery, the military-industrial complex, as Eisenhower called it. If there was a biosphere industrial complex, which at first sounds like an oxymoron, but the technologies are there, if you see what I mean, to regenerative agriculture, reforestation, ocean alkalinity, the various kinds of carbon drawdown that we are now going to have to do out of the atmosphere. It's like cleaning up our sewage after it's been dispersed. Hard, but not impossible, because biology works that way by bringing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere to grow plants. We can do it, and if we paid ourselves to do it, we have both the technologies and we have the people power, and then we would have the financial power. Nicholas Stern says it might take $4 trillion a year, every year. Other other estimates are 1 trillion. Right now, since we're at some kind of, well, private investment has been quite high, but adding more per year would be important to quickly decarbonize our technology. And this is, again, something that's possible. We have the technologies, both, what can you call it, mechanical, natural, and biological, and financial. If they were all put to it, we could maybe dodge the mass extinction event. So this is the green project described in Ministry for the Future. And it is right for you to point out the carbon coin, paying ourselves to do this good work so that we don't have to do it on our volunteer time or do it and starve doing it, but actually make a living doing it. And certain companies would probably make a profit doing it because that really is the name of the game for capitalism. Um, that's a little ugly. You could maybe tax that in a way that made it more socialized. I think so. But in any case, in the climate emergency, you have to use the tools you have. And those are the tools I've seen.
But wouldn't you say that arguably this kind of offer, let's call it green capitalism, has been made, at least to a certain extent, and it has been somewhat rejected by capital because they very much still stay within fossil capitalism to a large degree. But it has also, and I think this relates back to this question with regard to the affective layer, it has also been rejected by broad publics. And there are many reasons for that. For me, at least, one of the reasons is that it always smelled of a bad compromise in a certain way. And maybe the offer, the bold aspect that you talk about is not a bad thing to have because it might spook off the general public, but maybe it's a good thing to have in terms of bold proposals for a structurally different future might be the ones that are able to generate enough effective connection within a broader public in order to really create a sort of mass movement around these positive ideas of alternative futures. So, what I'm trying to say is that aren't we in a position where we can see the green capitalist quote unquote compromise as an offer that is seemingly more plausible and therefore possible has been exhausted somewhat. And we might have to think about alternative imaginaries of different futures, of structurally different futures that are much more radical in the best sense, you know? And I would argue that,
Mhm.
for example, democratic planning as a narrative carrier might be a structural element for these kinds of efforts. And you very much touch upon this carrier as well within your novels. And I'm asking myself if we aren't at a different crossroad right now, and that this demands maybe a reevaluation of what types of imaginaries are deemed possible and necessary, and what might be left behind because it has proven itself to be not effective as a mobilizing force as well.
Yeah, I take your point, and I'm thinking, and I will be thinking out loud for the sake of our podcast. Um, and the first thing I'm going to try to say, I'm going to try to sketch out a version where it's not actually a crossroads, but a situation of both and that we need to do both of these things with a sense of the sequence of it might be a vision of eco-socialism, starting with a stimulus that would be green capitalism or green Keynesian capitalism. And first, the green capitalism, although it's opposed by fossil fuel capitalism because they will end up with stranded assets. The clean energy transition will strand assets that I reckon are worth about 1,600 trillion US dollars. That's the fossil fuel, that's the supposed imaginary price or value of the fossil fuels that we need to leave in the ground so as not to cook the planet. About 3,000 gigatons of fossil fuels need to be left in the ground. We can only afford to burn about 500 more. And so the loss of 3,000 gigatons of money, and no matter how you value it, because $1,600 trillion is simply the current price of oil averaged across all this stuff, and the future isn't taken into account, et cetera, et cetera. But obviously, it's a lot of money left in the ground. Capital hates that. Stranded assets is a catastrophe because always they have to have profits. So, nevertheless, there is green capitalism. Invest in this and you'll make a profit. It might be even the highest rate of return if you take the long future into account and not cut it off at the next quarter, which makes it entirely destructive. But if you take the long view that we're going to be here for a while, and our children and children's children, then the most profitable course of action might be to invest in the green transition. So there is green capitalism, and individual capitalists have to be convinced that it's in their best interests as capitalists with children and grandchildren to invest in green rather than fossil fuels. That's an ongoing battle. Okay. But as you say, not particularly inspiring because it still implies that capital sucks value away from the workers. And there's still class, the people who have capital and then people who don't. And that little precariat in between of people who think they could gain capital if everything went right for them, which is, I suppose, what in America we call the middle class. Um, that struggle is ongoing and is uninspiring because it's one feels always under the thumb of an unequal system. And this is again why I talk about taxation. Heavily progressive taxation would mean the state would become quite rich, taking it away from the billionaires and from the 1% and pre-distributing it and redistributing it to the people who are in the lowest 50% who have no capital. But the eco-socialist vision, the sense that this is all an emergency kludge to get us out of the beginning of the mass extinction event and to stop burning carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Some rather unsavory tactics need to be followed, and some rich people will get richer. There isn't anything punitive or moralistic in a program that just says, let's not wreck the biosphere. That's just practical, and you do what you can in the current political economy to make that happen. But I myself here in the States, I'm a supporter and admirer of AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And she's just I was going to say a member of parliament. She's a House of representatives for Queens and the Bronx in New York City. But I don't know if she would call herself an eco-socialist, but for sure she's on the far left end of the American left, whatever you might. She's the progressive edge of the Democratic Party, and along with Bernie Sanders, the brand, the face on the brand. And then there's also the Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA, which I am a dues-paying member of, and entirely encouraged by the existence of this group, which is small and ineffective, except as a group that can organize people's emotions, to young people especially, to pull left on the Democratic Party in the United States. If the Democratic Party were to follow AOC and Bernie, possibly there might be a complete surge of popular support because of that vision that you're pointing to, of a kind of eco-socialist replacement where people actually do get the value of their work and are a member in equal standing and are not in the precariat and not in fear that one health crisis or firing or a piece of bad luck or a downturn in the economy will make them destitute and immiserated. That freedom from fear, as FDR called it, is a big part of the structure of feeling, of sense that I'm part of a society that values its people. This is why I talk about social democracy as being a step on the way. And the Scandinavians, especially in Denmark, they can say, well, we're boring and I hate Denmark, but I don't fear for my physical existence. You hear that a lot. People take for granted instantly the profound advantages of their societies and tend to focus on the things that still aren't right. And that's something that I see often. Indeed, the European Union is the next step in the political evolution of humanity, as clunky and, as you say, frozen as it is. When you go from being a nation state to being a member state, this is world historical. Because the international organizations are wimpy and they don't have teeth, and the European Union does. And that's one of the things that makes it locked, but it's one of the things that makes it interesting. If the United States and China, the EU and the BRIC countries were in a European Union plus, um, and the same kind of teeth obtained, then the European Parliament, as frozen and strange as it is, Brussels as capital of the world, would be better off than in the nation state system from Westphalia. So you got to take what notions of progress you can from the current situation, is what I'm saying. And in this case, to get back to the origins of your question, I'm just going to say both and. There are some really good green capitalists out there. They B Corp, they're running businesses. These are not giant businesses. They're not fossil fuel monsters. They are doing regenerative agriculture. They're doing, I mean, sometimes quite small scale things, sometimes quite important things. But in any case, they are businesses trying to make a profit and get investors. So there's capitalism and there is green capitalism, and it's not very inspiring, but it might be quite powerful given where we are right now.
Before we get to the very last question that I ask all of my guests, I would just really like to ask you one more question about the narrative aspect, and it has to do with the affective layer again, because I mean, we talked already about neoliberalism and the way in which it was able to attach itself to certain wishes and demands within the Lebenswelt, the everyday world of the people. And I think the market, quote unquote, the market as a Realfiktion, a real fiction, has been a very, very important element of this process. And I would be interested, what could be a similarly successful Realfiktion within climate counteraesthetics?
Yeah. First, I'm going to say, okay, so neoliberalism, it never privileged anybody but the rich, but it did take over as a narrative. How did that happen? It was an appeal to American self-reliance and English feelings of privilege and imperial arrogance. We are special, the special people of the world. And this isn't confined to the English and the Americans. Of course, there was a German moment of we are the special people of the world, etc. But in this case, with the Hayek neoliberalism, the Keynesian world and the liberation of the empires, where, as Sartre put it, it used to be there were a billion people and 4 billion natives, and now there's 5 billion people. Well, this was a shock, especially to the 1 billion who thought of themselves as so special. The numbers are wrong here, by the way, but you see what I mean. And in the United States, I mean, Britain lost its empire, and suddenly England was just this little island of resentful and nostalgic people. In America, this vision that we were the conquerors of the world and that we had saved democracy in World War II, but also self-reliance, that we were all cowboys and we needed nothing but our horse and our pistol and some land, and we could live off of it. These myths were what neoliberalism played into and then got enough people's approval of. so that the feeling of left liberation that blossomed in the 1960s because of the end of colonialism and because of all of the ferment, the anti-Vietnam War. The 60s were a period that looked like left liberation and an explosion of energy amongst the young. The 70s, it began to curdle and go wrong because capital was still there. Nothing had changed. And indeed, by the time Reagan and Thatcher instituted the neoliberal order in 1980, for a lot of us who were young at that time, it was like a door slamming in your face, closing on you, that you didn't know that door even existed. And suddenly, boom, your nose hit it, your body hit it, you fell backwards in dismay. You said, "What's this?" And by the time we had collected ourselves, the Cold War was over. We were into the 21st century. History's happening fast, but human lives are even faster. We live through, decade by decade, several political reincarnations each human life. And so I'm old enough that I can remember these. And so your question is a good one. What I want to interrogate in it, neoliberalism appealed to some backward looking reactionary impulses, and they only ever had maybe 51% of the popular votes to achieve legislation and deregulate and lower taxes for the rich, etc. That was always only the politicians that were bought, and then the votes that went to this notion of self-reliance as a cover story for more capitalist exploitation. So it can be explained. And then really what you're asking for is what's the next story? Well, climate change helps by being a spur in our butt. We either make a new story or else we foul our nest to the point where civilization crashes. So, emergency and an intense emergency that has never really been quite like this in all human history. That's the stimulus for a new story of mutual aid, solidarity, of also taking the wild animals as fellow citizens and as relatives of ours, as our cousins, of the biosphere as our extended body. And all these are truths out of ecology, but also out of your own lived experience. In your own lived experience, you know that half of the DNA inside your skin, inside your body, is not human DNA. You are, in fact, a political collective of alien creatures within yourself. And, eventually you die from that because it's hard to keep that going. It's so complex. And it's a new vision of the world. These are new facts. We did not know that 50% of the DNA in our body was not human DNA until about 10 or 15 years ago. And they haven't yet hit the political imaginary. But that's the story to tell. This is why I want the eco in eco-socialism. I like the Green parties in general and in principle because of their emphasis on the biosphere as our extended body and as fellow citizens that we need to represent in legislatures. So this is the story that I'm trying to tell. And Ministry for the Future is, in attempting to tell all these stories at once, well, it's 550 pages and covers about 30 years. So it had to be that way in order to say it coherently. I'm afraid that when I say it in an hour like this, that it's a scramble, let's say, or it is scrambled by trying to say too much at once. But that's political conversation. It's always that way. And in fact, actually, your questions on this line of thought for me has been very interesting to follow.
Oh, I'm glad to hear. That's great. And there's a last question that I ask all of my guests, and it is, if you think about the future, what makes you joyful?
Well, I'm going to be going to the Sierra Nevada and walking in the mountains, away from civilization and with a few friends and up in those high mountains with their own biome and their own wildlife that are living wildly on their own, and I'll see that. And that happens as I age out. It's less common in my life, fewer days per year, but more important in my life, more striking and joyful, with a touch of old age. But there is joy in old age, even when you know it may be coming to a close, an end. that can sometimes just accentuate the feelings of joy. Then also, I'm just back from COP30, and I can say this. The reporting on it as a political um, letdown and disappointment is both true and false. Because what COPs are, these climate COPs, this one in Belém, Brazil, was striking, is they are utopias. They are pop-ups, like a pop-up store or a pop-up concert or a pop-up gathering. They're pop-up utopias. I wandered these halls, 64,000 people from all over the world, from every country on earth, except for maybe a couple. But there they all were, every kind of face and a being, mostly more your age than my age, mostly women, I would say perhaps 55 or 60% women, and all of them intent to save the world. So it was a joyful experience. It was intense. It was strange. It was partial, but I was exhilarated. I wanted the halls. It was just almost the sublime. You know, this old feeling of the combination of beauty and terror. It was more beautiful than sublime, to tell you the truth. There wasn't much terror in it, except that, you know, this little thing is just a tiny little fragment of mirror facing up to civilization at large. It's only a mirror. It's rather small, and it's only there for 2 weeks a year. Um, so it isn't like it's particularly significant, but it is beautiful. And it did give me joy. I was very glad that I went, even though it was a troublesome to go there. And in some senses, I think I help people. I think the Ministry for the Future helps people, but I certainly don't need to go to these things on a regular basis. I don't add that much value, and I don't get much out of them. And I can get joy closer to home in my daily life. My garden gives me joy, but also as something deeper. But maybe joy is the right word for it, really. A feeling of being grounded, literally, and of contentment and of joy that comes from daily life. There's a good book by Rebecca Solnit called Orwell's Roses, that in the midst of World War II and in the midst of his busy and troubled life, that George Orwell kept a rose garden, and it was very important to him. And he also ran a grocery store with great pleasure. Ordinary life, if you pay attention, and that's crucial, and if you get outdoors as much as you can, also important. It has its joys, and that's what, especially since I'm wintering in my boring little town, I have to focus on the joys that I have. And so sports, garden, writing, talking to family.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Stan, thank you so much for being part of Future Histories.
Thank you, Jan. It's been a pleasure.
That was our show for today. Thanks a lot for listening. If you want to support Future Histories, you can do so on Patreon. For this, visit patreon.com/futurehistories, or you can simply tell a friend that you liked the show and that he, she, or they might like it as well. Thanks a lot, and hear you in 2 weeks.